In this episode, we tackle the important topic of energy and human rights, and must preface this by addressing the fact that much has changed with the geopolitical climate since the time of recording. While much of this material remains relevant, we try to be mindful of these dynamics while presenting everyone with critical insights and valuable conversations.
We need a rapid shift to renewable energy in order to address climate change, but we also need to make sure that it's fair. How do we build these new sources of energy in a way that is the most respectful of people and our planet?
Welcome to reVyven, where environmental ideas come to life. At reVyven, we aim to connect, learn, and make a difference.
Today, we are here with Nico Horvat, and Nico's goal is to work towards rights respecting climate action by investors and companies. And you're currently working as an independent consultant for various NGOs. Is that right?
That's right. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming today. And the goal of your work is to support those organizations that integrate human rights into climate action through research, strategy, and thought leadership.
Exactly.
Okay, very interesting. Do you want to give us a little bit of background about yourself or maybe how you got into this field?
Sure. So I'm originally from Hungary, and I've kind of moved around quite a lot throughout my studies and my professional life. But I was very lucky to have had the opportunity to start my professional career through an internship with a small organization at the time called Business and Human Rights Resource Center. And it's really through that internship that I got introduced to the concept of corporate responsibility for human rights, business and human rights. And I started working across the fields of how to hold companies accountable for their human rights responsibilities, and then moved into the climate change space through that as well.
I'd imagine that's quite dynamic.
It is. It is. There's a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of actors. It's a very exciting space. At the time, there were a lot of new norms being formed that are now feel like they have been in the field for ages. And yeah, it was a very exciting time to be there.
And now you're doing that work in Switzerland, but I would imagine are you global, the work that you do?
Yes, exactly. So I still work. I consult independently with the same NGO where I started my career with Business and Human Rights Resource Center, but also with various other NGOs and organizations. So I've previously worked within the responsible investor space, focusing on climate change and with net zero coalitions with investors. And my work really is global, so it's not focused on any particular region, but more on the how can we create momentum and climate right respecting climate action worldwide.
That's fantastic.
Nice.
Yeah, that's so nice. We want to start by prefacing this conversation with the fact that Robert and I are not experts in renewable energy. That's really important for us to state. We thank you for opening our horizons to this topic because we did a lot of research and kind of learning more about it as much as we could in preparation for our conversation today. Finally, we want to state that we know that this space can be controversial, political, with a lot of entities involved in it. And there are a lot of people who are for and against renewable energy, a lot of people who are for and against the continued use of fossil fuels, and those that are also proponents of nuclear energy. For the sake of the conversation today, I think we'll really focus on renewable energy. To dive into the most basic conversation, what is renewable energy, Aniko?
So renewable energy is energy that is produced from natural sources and that is replenished at a higher rate than it is consumed. So the most common forms of renewable energy are wind, the sun, and water, so hydropower. And my work focuses on wind and solar specifically.
And what is your take? Do you believe that renewable energy is the way forward? And I know it's a personal question, so.
Absolutely. So I absolutely believe that renewable energy is the way forward. And it's our biggest chance to help prevent the worst impacts of climate change that we're already seeing today. We've relied on fossil fuels for too long, and we now know that they cause dangerous climate impacts. So we need to phase them out as soon as possible. So the question for me is, and the question that I work on is, how do we build these new sources of energy in a way that is the most respectful of people and our planet?
Mhm. And just to give a little bit of historical reference, we did research on this, like how long have we actually been using fossil fuels? And so from what we were able to go back and look at, it seems like their true introduction was during the Industrial Revolution is when we really became heavily reliant on them. So in Britain, I think that was the 18th century and the 19th century in the US. So we've been using them and relying on them as our primary energy source for quite a long time. And so why is it essential that we move away from fossil fuels as this primary energy source?
So this one is pretty straightforward for me. It's
Okay.
because fossil fuels, and by that we mean coal, oil, and gas, are the largest contributor to climate change. So again, very simply put, fossil fuels produce a large quantity of carbon dioxide when they're burned. Carbon emissions trap the heat in the atmosphere, and that leads to a climate change. And according to the UN, the fossil fuels specifically account for over 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions and nearly 90% of all carbon dioxide emissions. So we now know, and we have known for a while, that we need to phase them out. That's why it's important. And we're already experiencing severe impacts of climate change around the world.
Yeah. And it's interesting because there are so many sectors. We just did a large program with Impact Hub and my colleague Beth on fashion. And fashion contributes to global carbon emissions. But when you look at fossil fuels, it's so much more significant than it just takes up such a big sector of this area. So that's really.
Can I just pose the question? If they were able to capture and remove that at the source, would it be as bad as it is today?
So that is a very interesting question, and carbon capture and removal technology is one of the main topics that the oil and gas industry is proposing as a potential solution. The technology is not there yet. It's
Right.
not. There are some smaller projects that are underway, and that will be necessary in order to reach net zero emissions. But those are for what is called unabated emissions.
Yeah.
So basically, sectors that will not be possible to decarbonize because of some technological considerations. So that the carbon capture technology we will need for that. We do not need it, we need to phase out all other fossil fuel emissions. So for all other sectors that we can electrify and decarbonize, we need to as soon as possible.
Okay.
And as part of the danger continuing on the trajectory we're on with the use of fossil fuels, the fact that there are obviously health implications, there are planetary implications, but there's also the thought that some of these resources, coal, oil, and gas, we are depleting our resources quite quickly. So they will eventually run out.
Yes.
So this is also a reason for looking into alternative energy sources.
Absolutely. So usually, according to UN guiding principles on business and human rights, companies need to gain leverage and increase their leverage to influence companies in their supply chain or business partners to change their business practices or improve their human rights practices. But there are instances where this is not possible. So there are very strong reports from the UN Special Rapporteur on modern slavery and other UN experts on forced labor risks in Xinjiang, specifically around solar panels and around other manufacturing processes as well. So these are instances in which companies need to undertake their human rights due diligence to see if they're connected with these risks, use their leverage if they're able to, but they're not, then end business relationship and find alternative sources, find whether it's alternative technologies or alternative sources of the materials that they need from their regions, these regions or these situations. And it's not just this particular situation, it may be others as well.
Yeah, I had read something where they had, at least in the US, where they had stopped importation from solar panels coming from there. And just completely stopped them. And so the companies who were ordering it or working to import, they just blocked it at the border because they wouldn't let it in because of those issues.
Yeah, so there's a regulation enforced called the UFLPA, so the Forced Labor Protection Act, and that requires companies to undertake supply chain traceability and show that they're not sourcing from certain regions and specifically from Xinjiang.
I think this is where transparency and understanding supply chains is so essential. And it came up with the Rana Plaza disaster with the clothing manufacturer. And when that transpired, a lot of companies had no idea if that particular factory was part of their supply chain. So I think this is where companies have to have the due diligence to understand the full supply chain that they're supporting as an organization. I say this, and I know that these are humans. These are people who are mothers and fathers, and I think to exploit humans on that level is just tragic. And this is where, as individuals, we do have some agency in how we spend our money and the companies we support. And, it is demand. If we stop buying from certain companies because we know their practices are horrible in terms of human rights and it's just pure exploitation, that we do have agency over that. And we need to remember that voting with our money, it does have power.
If you look at the cost to do the right thing, the product may be a little bit more expensive, but at least you're voting with your money to make sure that it doesn't happen to people, right? So the awareness of, as a consumer, you should at least pay attention to where the money's going.
Yeah, exactly. In the apparel sector, the Rana Plaza disaster has had a huge impact, and transparency and traceability is much more developed, I would say, in the apparel sector, ironically, even though it's not great, than in the renewable energy sector. If you can imagine kind of the scale of the kind of, if that is the comparison that we're making here. So the parallel is still stands that transparency is critical in order to understand where you get your materials from, and in order to act on what is happening and make sure that your materials are being produced in a responsible way.
Yeah. And I think as citizens, we can demand that from the people we support, whether that be financially, the people we vote for. We can request that. It should be transparent. And I think it's a really big part of the puzzle. I think it's really essential. And as we continue to explore renewable energy, why is it important for renewable energy companies to pay close attention to human rights? And this was your question, and that's something I should have said in the beginning, because this is not an area that we are deeply immersed the way that you are. So Iniko has been kind enough to source some of these questions for us that she really thinks are important to bring to light. So thank you for that.
So we need, again, just to emphasize, we need a rapid shift to renewable energy in order to address climate change. But we also need to make sure that it's fair and it respects people and planet. And that's the piece of the bigger puzzle that I work on. And it's important to support a transition that respects the workers in supply chains, for example, or the communities that live around the wind farms or solar power projects, especially in areas where there are indigenous peoples that may have rights to their land for centuries. So to keep it simple, the idea is that if these companies take care to ensure that they treat their workers and communities in a respectful way, then they will be able to operate smoothly and eventually deliver the renewable energy that we need. If they don't do it, they may face resistance in terms of community opposition, in terms of legal action, reputational damage, etc. So it is really in their interest to respect and their responsibility to respect human rights throughout their operations and value chains. So, I mean, you would think that it's of course common sense and everyone aims to do that, but it's not so simple because there are many stakeholders out there and we are trying to shift to renewable energy very quickly. So it does and has fallen by the wayside. That being said, there are very clear international standards and resources that companies can use to make sure that they respect human rights.
And do you find that in the work you do, a lot of companies take this into account? Is it something that they need to be held accountable for? Is it something that needs to be set in place before they go into these areas?
So yes, it is something that they need to think about and consider before they go into, for example, developing a renewable energy project. One of the first steps is even before getting the land permits is to make sure that they consult with the communities on the ground. If it's indigenous communities, that they seek their free, prior, and informed consent, and they do so in an inclusive way. And similarly, when they open factories or they engage within their supply chain, even before they seek a new supplier, for example, they have to do due diligence on what that supplier's practices and policies are in terms of workers' rights, in terms of their own respect for the environment, their own respect for the rights of communities around their operations, etc.
Yeah. When we something I want to talk about. We talked about human rights and then I pivoted. But when you talk about a just transition to renewable energy, can you describe what that means exactly and why that's so important, Aniko?
Yes, so a just transition, I really think about it in two different ways. So two sides of a coin. One is the transition away from fossil fuels needs to be just. And by that I mean the workers and communities that have relied on fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas for decades need to be involved in the, for example, decommissioning of projects, of the closure of coal mines, let's say. And there's a lot of work that trade unions, labor unions are doing on this. They need to be involved in social dialogue. They need to have skills retraining in place. They need just transition plans together with companies and local governments. And there are various examples of how these can be done. And again, it's mainly the trade union movement that is leading on this. The flip side of it is the transition towards renewable energy. And that's kind of the side that I'm working on more. And by that, I mean transitioning in a just way or in a fair way, respecting, that's what we've been talking about today, respecting the rights of workers and communities that are in the whole operations and value chain of the renewable energy sector.
To add to that, I mean, that sounded more like raw material extraction companies. And how about companies that are making products like electric vehicles, for example? And how should they hold themselves accountable, or even their supply chain accountable for things like this? I mean, that's part of the puzzle, but
Yeah. So it's the whole value chain. You're right.
Yeah.
So let's take for the piece that I work on in terms of wind and solar, the way that it works is that there are these wind and solar project developers. So those can be either independent power producers or utility companies that actually go out and seek the permits, develop the projects on the ground. And they have a whole rather complicated supply chain, of course, I mean, for various elements for their main technologies. So the wind turbines and the solar panels, they have manufacturers that they need to engage with or need to source the wind turbines or solar panels from. And those manufacturers, of course, have to source their raw materials from other companies as well. Some are integrated, especially in the solar sector, which means that they do some of the sourcing themselves, but most are not. Most have very complicated supply chains because they have a range of raw materials, including metals, critical minerals that they need to produce the wind turbines and solar panels. So yes, it's kind of that whole chain that needs to engage on human rights, and they can't kind of necessarily, they each have their own responsibilities. They can't forego their responsibility to respect the rights of workers and communities in their areas of operations and in their supply chains. But yeah, it goes all the way down to manufacturers as well,
And the traceability.
or mining companies.
Yeah,
sorry,
but the traceability can be very complex.
Traceability can be very complex, and that is one of the cutting edge issues that the industry is now working on. So there are some companies that are starting to be able to trace specific minerals from the source all the way to their products, but it's very, very early days. So there's a lot of exciting work that's going on that, actually.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when you look at land, this is something that we were part of a local library conversation with books that we read, but I always find it fascinating, like who owns land and how can companies go in and utilize land that essentially, I don't know if it's doesn't have ownership, but there are people who utilize that land and rely on that land for everyday living and use. So that's always something that's really intriguing for me. So if you're, whether it be mining or whether it be putting wind turbines in the ocean, how do you deal with the land rights?
It's huge.
Yeah.
It's huge. That's one of the other, biggest questions in terms of project development, but also in terms of supply chain. And so land rights in terms of kind of the legal sense are mostly there in developing countries or in developed countries and developing countries, and a lot of countries where there are indigenous peoples who have customary land rights. So they may not be even recorded in the legal sense. That is very difficult. And there we get into challenges of, for example, the government saying to a company, here, these are the communities that you need to consult with. And then communities saying, there may be additional communities that don't have the legal land rights who may be impacted by the project, and they wouldn't be included on that specific list. So then it's very challenging for the companies as well to respect the rights of the communities that may not have not have been included in the original consultation list. So that is why it is a complex space, and it is also it's both the responsibility of companies and governments to make sure that they're identifying communities in an appropriate way, and they're engaging with all affected or potentially affected stakeholders when developing projects. And in the offshore sense, a lot of the time it's fisheries or fishing communities that they need to engage with, for example, and doing that appropriately in a timely manner, in an inclusive manner, is really important to get the social license that they need to operate.
Yeah.
And I would imagine it's also more complex because that's mainly, let's say, land access rights.
Mhm.
And then you still have pollution, airborne pollution from whatever
Yeah.
they're doing, or the water and the runoff and the downstream impacts of whatever
Yeah.
they're doing. So is that looked at as a whole, or just the land access?
I know, absolutely. So when
Okay.
we're talking about consultations, then it needs to be, land is one piece that we've just started talking about, but absolutely they need to pay attention to a range of other potential impacts. So one of the impacts that I've seen of my work is, for example, the infrastructure or the roads that need to be built in
Right.
order to
Yeah, yeah.
access some of the projects that go through communities or that impact traditional grazing routes for various types of husbandry. So there's a lot of different considerations, and it's it's the responsibility of companies to identify those impacts, and this is where the norms that I mentioned earlier comes in. So there's this set of international standards called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that sets out very clearly the responsibilities of companies on human rights, the states or the government's duty to protect human rights, and both of their responsibility to provide access to remedy. And then there are more specific norms and standards that come into play on responsible mineral sourcing, on due diligence. So there's a lot out there in terms of what can help companies and governments.
Yeah. I always think of this because I listened to a podcast years ago, and it's applicable to us because Robert was born and raised in Santa Barbara, California. But this podcast brought to light that for years, the oil rigs were offshore and they were commissioned to be there for, I think, a set number of years.
Long time.
It
But they're
was,
starting to take a few down.
and so what they discovered with the oil rigs that were off the coast in California was that sea life had attached to I guess the
Yeah, the
legs.
pylons,
Yeah,
yeah.
the pylons. And so there was a really big environmental issue with that. If you remove them as they were initially told to, then you got rid of entire ecosystems that had attached themselves to the pylons. They were seeing species come back. It was really, in that way, I think it was something that they had never conceptualized in the beginning of this project. So I think, from my understanding, if I recall correctly, what they decided to do was to cut the pylons below
Just below the surface, or
So-
deep enough that it doesn't affect shipping.
Yeah, but it was not part of the original plan that they would leave these in. But I always think it's such an interesting issue that it's so hard to see in the future, or there are so many issues that we don't take into account when we put these systems in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why, there are these, processes that are in place and procedures that you can follow, like do human rights impact assessments, environmental impact assessments, where some of this would come to surface. And again, it's engaging with the right stakeholders. So maybe in this case, it should have been, or I don't know the case at all, but perhaps environmental groups may have foreseen some of it. It may be that they wouldn't have foreseen any of it. And in that case, you need to adapt your approach. And it's a continuous process. And that is exactly why it's a continuous process, these human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence processes, because you need to continuously consult, engage, and respond and integrate into the way that you address these issues.
Yeah, I think that's really important to note, is that it's not foolproof, and
Yeah.
we're discovering it. And as we're going through these alternative energy sources, there are things that we're going to learn, obviously,
Yeah,
along the
absolutely.
way. And I know this is taking us slightly off topic, but I'm very curious. What is so interesting to me with wind turbines is the sheer scale of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always think you have to be so technical to be able to provide and do maintenance on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how do you decommission something of that scale?
Mm-hmm. So yes, there, especially with offshore wind turbines, one of the main kind of operational challenges is around health and safety, and it is, I mean, that's where it's interesting, the connection between the outgoing fossil fuel industry and the skills that are needed there in terms of the workforce. So oil rigs, for example, offshore, and offshore wind turbines. So there are some kind of transferable skill sets that we can use, and there are many people working on how can we make sure that the skills that are needed for renewable energy projects, whether it's operation and maintenance, whether it's decommissioning, engineering, etc., are available. But yes, that is a big challenge, and health and safety is a big challenge as well. And it's one that the industry is very aware of and is continuously addressing and improving their processes. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd imagine it could be an emerging course of study, emerging technical skills, really very
Yeah.
intense.
Yeah.
And it probably varies depending on the type of renewable energy that you're
Yeah.
implementing.
Yeah.
I'm curious, as we're talking about decommissioning, is that factored into, let's say, the energy, the renewable energy source calculations for implementing a wind turbine and then tearing it down? Because,
Yeah.
I mean, even the base structure of concrete and steel have to be removed and cut up and recycled. I mean, even some of those things just to implement are already like pretty intensive for CO2.
Yes, so it is, and so they're called life cycle analysis assessments, and they're absolutely factored in, and they're kind of very rigorous standards for undertaking those, and the major wind turbine companies are doing that quite rigorously.
And the blades are made out of metal?
Probably a mix of
Metals?
different types of materials.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the blades are layered with balsa wood usually, because that's a relatively flexible type of wood, and
Carbon
steel,
fiber or
carbon fiber, exactly, and different, exactly. And
like
the reason,
fiberglass or something.
yeah, the reason that it's difficult to recycle them is that there are lots of layers that are all kind of meshed together, and it's similar in solar panels. Some parts of solar panels are relatively easy to recycle, like the glass elements, but then there's some that are so kind of meshed together that it's difficult to take them apart and recycle them. So that's another area that I mean the solar industry is also working on.
Yeah.
Or they have thin films that are very
Yes.
difficult. You can't really strip them, or they're like
Yes.
assembled. So it's
This is something we talk a lot about, and I think the circular economy really focuses on is decoupling of materials and how difficult that is when we have blended materials, like whether that be in clothing, whether that be in like wind turbine blades. It makes it a bit more difficult to keep that in circularity because you can't break down and separate the parts very easily.
Yeah.
Or we're not there yet in terms of the technology. And I want to pivot because I think this is something to state, and maybe that this is where maybe opposition for renewable energy can come in. We were in Andermatt, I think last year or the year before, but it was a very cloudy day. So it's a day in the Alps when the clouds would come in and then they would recede, but they would hang low. And until they receded, you had no idea where you were. You could have been anywhere, but we could hear this noise. It was like a whoosh. But we didn't know that they had wind turbines on the top of the mountain. And so then when the clouds would clear, you could really see these. And I have to say, it felt almost like you were in a completely different landscape. It was otherworldly.
daunting.
Yeah. And I think there were 3 on that
3 or
mountain,
4.
3 or 4. And we almost became fixated by them because we walked underneath them. We were looking at them. The scope and the scale of them is unbelievable. The noise that they generate. And I'm wondering if this is part of the resistance. I know it's an issue in Switzerland, is that because they can be so imposing in terms of their size, and because in Switzerland we have really pristine, beautiful landscapes, so there's opposition to
Encroaching on the
to put massive wind turbines in pristine nature.
Or even like the solar panels in Sosfay, right? All these projects that are, I guess, going into nature when we may have buildings already that could use them. But
Yeah. So
sorry topic.
yeah, no, but I think it's really valid because maybe if we had more of a creative solution or we didn't have to impede on nature so much. I was also watching a TED Talk where someone was talking about they use a lot of desert land, or there is an area in California
Yeah, in the
where,
Mojave Desert.
yeah, where they put massive amounts of solar panels.
Mhm.
And he was painting a very visual where they had to remove landscape and ecosystems, and there was a turtle population, and they were trying to preserve them before they put the solar panels in. But I'm wondering if there's a creative solution or ways that, like the way that we care about, or we're hoping people care about indigenous cultures and people, that we also look at the ecosystems and the land and come up with ways around that. Do you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is a bit outside of the scope of my specific work, but I
Yeah.
do know, and I think what we're talking about here is kind of two things. One is the social acceptance, like the broader
Yeah.
social
Yeah.
acceptance.
Yeah.
And the second is kind of the environmental, like the flip side of, or kind of the other puzzle piece to the human rights impact assessment work that I do, is all the environmental impact assessment work that goes into citing, wind or solar projects. And there are various things there that can be taken into consideration. So for the social acceptance, I mean, yes, I mean, part of it, I know that the industry is spending a lot of time in terms of, again, kind of inclusive consultations and education and kind of understanding what works and what doesn't. The fact is that countries need to address climate change and kind of reach their net zero targets with the resources that they have available. So in some countries, this will be the sun, because they have a lot of sun abundance, solar resources available. In some countries, it will be hydropower. So actually, Switzerland relies, most of its renewable energy relies on hydropower. But hydropower can also be quite intermittent because of the effects of climate change. So there can be droughts, and that can be challenging as well in terms of meeting the kind of goals in terms of renewable energy capacity. So countries have to use what they have available, and of course take into consideration a range of other factors in terms of social acceptance. But that is still the case. Or kind of offshore, for example, like Switzerland doesn't have offshore options. They can import renewable energy. That's a whole other conversation in terms of the grid infrastructure and the transportation that needs to be put in place in order to be able to do that. For the environmental side, there are projects that, again, I'm not as familiar with, but in terms of coupling solar and agriculture, for example, doing it in a way that there could be bigger solar projects, but at the same time, there could be agricultural activity on the land as well. Of course, there's rooftop solar. There are other ways in which they can be implemented. And yeah, that is exactly why it's important to cite these places with both human rights and environmental considerations in mind, and make sure that they're respectful of both people and planet.
Yeah, I think that's so important, particularly when you have, I just always feel like Switzerland's so beautiful. And I think it's part of the attraction and the allure of the country is that we still have so much alpine space and open land. And yeah, I could see that being a reason that people are not so inclined to accept renewable energy.
It's interesting because for me, I was just in the mountains near Saint Croix, so like an hour and a half away from here, and I did a trail run, and I saw wind turbines as well. And for me, it was kind of the opposite reaction. Maybe it's because I work in the field, but it just fills me with hope and like, oh, it's possible even here. Like, how amazing!
Yeah.
And I'm aware that there are challenges in building, in constructing wind turbines in very high altitudes, for example. But it does fill me with hope that it is possible in the most kind of extreme conditions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also an interesting way to look at it, that it is hopeful and there is opportunity to go into a different area with it. We're aware that mining is part of renewable energy. I think the most heavily used area is in batteries, if I'm correct in that. I'm not totally sure. But How is mining extraction done? And we know that this varies depending on the type of mining and the type of mineral you're trying to get. And then where are the most prevalent places this is taking place? And how does that impact indigenous cultures? So it's a lot of questions.
Okay, let me try to
Yeah, sorry.
to kind of to answer them all together or kind of step by step. So in terms of where mining is taking place for renewable energy, critical minerals that are required for renewable energy technologies. So the main technologies that need critical minerals are, yes, batteries, absolutely, wind turbines, solar panels, and those are the ones that I and the organizations that I work for look at. A lot of it kind of depends on the stage of the value chain. So the extraction itself is one part, and then you have to do the processing and the smelting and refining. So the extraction is really geographically tied because, of course, it depends on where those deposits are in the world. And I mean, some of the main places are, so Australia has a lot of bauxite, manganese, lithium. Chile, which is a place where I've done some work in the past, has a lot of the copper, lithium. China is huge, both in terms of the raw materials, but also in terms of the refining and smelting and processing of the materials, both for batteries and for solar panels and wind turbines as well. DRC for cobalt, and that's a huge one in terms of human rights. A lot of international organizations have done work on human rights challenges and DRC, Brazil. These are some of the countries that are kind of significant, but there are others that are out there as well. And I mean, in terms of how mining is done, it's a range from, it really depends on the type of mineral, but it ranges from artisanal to large scale mining. Some minerals, interestingly, are not mined in the traditional sense that we think of mining. So lithium, example of this in Chile and the lithium triangle that I had a chance to do field work in a few years ago, I've seen how they pump up brine. So that's a mix of water and minerals and lithium, specifically deposits from deep underground. And then they have these huge kind of flats where they evaporate the water and collect the raw lithium deposits that then they ship off to other countries, primarily China, to process and make into battery grade lithium. So that's one example in terms of how it's done. In terms of indigenous people's rights, that's a big issue, and it is a topic that I've done some work on. Indigenous people's lands have been historically affected by mining, and more than 50%, an estimate that I've seen is more than 50% of the critical mineral reserves are located in indigenous lands. So that's really significant. And one of the organizations that I work with has a tracker called the Transition Minerals Tracker that looks at 6 or now 7 of the key minerals and how they impact, how the main large scale mining operations impact human rights. And it has found that Indigenous peoples disproportionately bear the brunt of the allegations, and this includes threats, attacks, intimidations to Indigenous peoples that are defending their land. They're in this particular tracker, it's 10% of all the allegations are related to Indigenous peoples, and specifically, quite a lot of the concerns are related to their right of free, prior, and informed consent, and that's a concept that is very important in this field, and it's very challenging for companies to implement because it means the right of Indigenous peoples to provide or withhold their consent to projects that affect their lives and livelihoods and cultural heritage. And the withholding part is the one that's challenging to uphold because they have the right to say no to projects as well.
Yeah. When I was doing research for this, I watched a documentary film. We'll reference that in the show notes. But for me, having very little idea or background knowledge about what lithium mining actually is, it was really fascinating, I guess, from that standpoint. But can you kind of paint a picture of what that looks like? I mean, even the baths or the flats of the, I think
Evaporation
it's,
ponds.
yeah, that
Yeah.
it's fascinating. The color, the amount of workers that are coming in and out. Is there anything airborne that is toxic to that area? I mean, a lot of people were wearing masks, they were in full suits. And I think, gosh, it's probably very difficult to contain all of that to one
And some of the
area.
photos, I mean, they look really beautiful and clean, like
Mm-hmm.
images and stuff. But when you look at it, it's like everything's coated in white.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's masked or suited. I mean, I'm assuming it's highly toxic.
So I can't say much about the actual area of operation because I haven't visited the site themselves, but I have visited the communities that live around them.
Yeah.
So what I can say is that in Chile, in the lithium extraction is done in the Atacama Desert, which
Yeah.
is one of the driest places on Earth. And the communities that live around these sites, around these evaporation ponds, have been relying on the land for various uses, and the water extraction specifically is very challenging. So what I have seen is when we're visiting different remote communities, then kind of huge trucks of water being brought into the community because they don't have the water that they need for their agricultural activities, their husbandry, their livelihoods, etc. So that's one piece. And the main challenge is that they haven't been consulted adequately around about the operations, and they do not receive adequate benefits out of the extraction that's going on in their lands. And that's the main challenge in a lot of these projects, that because communities are not consulted adequately upfront, or not all communities are consulted, then the benefits are not shared appropriately with them. And because of that, they end up resisting some of the operations, or some communities end up resisting the operations. It can create conflicts as well if consultations are not done correctly. So that it's a very challenging, landscape.
Yeah. And I think, and I say this from a book that I'm currently reading, which is Braiding Sweetgrass, but it talks about indigenous cultures and that they work in harmony with the land,
Mhm.
and there's a true reverence for the land. And
Yeah.
it's not a relationship of ownership or take, it's a give and take. And it's really having respect for the land and its abundance. And I would imagine that for indigenous people, and I'm saying this from an outsider's perspective, but that could be very difficult to be a part of, to watch a very different mindset, that this is purely capitalistic and it's not having the reverence, and it's not living in connection or harmony with the nature. And to me, I find that almost tragic. And then it begs the question, well, when we have finished with, let's say, for example, a lithium mine, wherever that may be, what does that decommissioning look like? Is that land just ever going to be able to be used or again, or is it just become we walk away from that and it served its purpose and now we're finished?
Yeah, I mean, those are some of the questions that these communities have to address and have to grapple with, and they're not straightforward, and that's why a lot of these consultation processes are quite challenging internally as well for communities, and may create divisions within communities as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, to me it's so powerful. And I think in this space, so much of it is visual, right? It's visual to see how we mine, it's visual to see the land and how it's been transformed for these purposes. I mean, and this goes for, I think, all energy sectors. I'm not pointing out exclusively renewables or oil, gas, and coal, or even nuclear, but it's very interesting. And I think we obviously need the energy source, but it's interesting to see the transformation of the land
I
in
would
those.
even argue probably everything that we consume, if you really saw how it was put together,
Yes.
harvested, whatever, everyone would probably open their mouth a little bit
Yeah, I
And
think
and
you're
say
right.
yeah,
something.
and I think that's the other part that we haven't touched on quite yet, and that's kind of the other piece of the puzzle that we need to look at is, yes, there is all this mining that is needed to produce the renewable energy technologies that we need, but we also need to think about how can we consume less energy? How can
Exactly.
we
Yeah.
have less demand for batteries, for example? So when you mentioned electric vehicles absolutely is the right alternative to internal combustion engine vehicles, but Is it the right alternative to transportation in general? Not necessarily. Public transportation. How can we make public transportation more accessible, more affordable? Train networks.
I mean, in Switzerland, it's fantastic, but people
Yes,
still go out and buy the Teslas. It's like, well, guys,
exactly.
we're already using electricity for the trains. Like, come on, can you just stop using your car?
Exactly. So we are very
Yeah,
lucky to live in a
yeah,
city, Basel, where that's very bikeable.
yeah,
So yeah, exactly. Why don't use your bike instead of
yeah.
taking your car to work? Or we are lucky that the city also invests in electrifying buses, that it's not necessarily the case in a lot of places.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that needs to be done at a city, municipal level and
Mhm.
national level and also kind of regional level to enable all of these factors to come together.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought that up because I do think it's an essential part of this is that to really be aware and to have a cognitive shift of how much we use, how much we almost
Yeah.
recklessly use
Yes.
and
Yeah.
unnecessarily use,
Yeah, yeah,
and really think of alternative models. Can we do car sharing? Can we, if we have to take a car, can we make sure there's more than one person in that
Hmm.
vehicle?
Yeah.
Can we use different infrastructure? Can we bike? Can we?
even the thing that really annoys me is like the e-scooters in the city.
Mhm.
It's like we have the best public transportation.
Yeah.
There's bike lanes everywhere. It's really short to walk, and yet we have these e-scooters everywhere. And I'm like, they're just not necessary,
Yeah.
right? Using less and focusing on things that are necessary are important. But
Yeah, and and transportation is one piece, but
yeah,
then I mean, when it comes to, energy, it's also how do we make sure that our homes are more energy
hmm,
efficient? How do we make sure that we use less electricity? How do we kind of engage with the power companies or utility
yeah,
companies that are
yeah.
providing our energy? So it's a range of things that we can do.
Yeah. And can people be incentivized for
Hmm.
whether it be in areas that have the infrastructure to support this? Because even we're coming from America, we lived in a tiny little community, but there were no sidewalks.
Mm,
And so I think this is a really big issue is infrastructure that
yeah,
supports people doing the right thing and being less
absolutely.
reliant on cars and different modes of. And when we talk, what can people and individuals and citizens, energy customers
Mhm.
do to ensure a just energy system?
Yeah, so I think that's what we started talking about now.
Yeah.
I mean, just very taking it from kind of an individual level, look at your building where you live. How is that heated? Is it energy efficient? How can you engage with is it your building manager or utility company to make sure that it is as environmentally responsible as possible? As a citizen, depending on where you vote, looking at your representatives, how are they engaging on climate change, renewable energy? Are they phasing out the fossil fuel subsidies that are still in place in a lot of places? Are they giving permits to new oil and gas projects that should not be the case, et cetera? And then engaging with them on it, or at least voting for the ones that you believe are taking the right decisions. And then I have a 4 and a 7-year-old, so as parents as well, engaging with our kids on these topics, which I know you do quite
Yeah.
a lot through your work.
Yeah.
But that is so important because they're going to be the ones who are going to make these decisions and who will bear the brunt of a lot of decisions that are made now as well.
Or lack of
Or
decision.
lack of decisions,
Yeah.
exactly. So like having them be engaged and aware, and yeah, it's super important.
Yeah. And it's a big component, and it's something that we always say, having the privilege of sitting down with different people in different sectors, we're exposed to all different ideas and concepts, but there are certain themes that always come back.
Hmm.
And one is that most things are very political.
Hmm.
Another one is things take time and it's never perfect and
Yeah.
at the beginning. And then the other one is how critical education is in
Hmm.
this. And education, not changing people's viewpoints, but exposure to
Hmm.
different ideas and also just creating awareness
Yeah.
is really critical. And then I was having a conversation with someone about this the other day, and we were talking about the necessity for quality. And his statement was really valid. And he said, people don't understand what quality is in terms of our consumer goods,
Mhm.
but if they don't understand it and they don't see it and how difficult it is and the time consumption that it takes in order
Hmm.
to put this in place, they will never value it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think this is where public awareness is key. Education is also.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And this will probably, I don't mind sounding not educated on this, but when we talk about renewable energy, how do developing nations work within this? I mean, and I say that because I don't know, are they able to put these wind turbines and solar panels in place? Is there support and networks to facilitate this?
So there are, so that's a challenging topic, and that's one that in climate negotiations as well, it's called the differentiated responsibility, that common but differentiated responsibility that states have to have, because of course developing nations did not contribute to climate
Yes.
change and industrialization as much as developed nations have. So yes, and that's another topic within the broader frame of just transition and energy justice, climate justice. So there still are many communities that are not able to access energy. So energy poverty is one of the big issue in developing countries. So we need to look at that as well. But they are overall mechanisms to support, and there need to be more mechanisms to support developing countries to shift away from fossil fuels. There are a few examples. So in Glasgow at COP26 a few years ago, the concept of just energy transition partnerships was launched, and that's basically a mechanism to support selected developing countries to move away through a just transition from the reliance of fossil fuels and coal-fired power plants, etc. So, and there are some of these already in place, some of these that are under discussion, but there needs to be a lot more, and it's both on the side of developed countries and the kind of international framework to provide that support, but also on investors to be able to facilitate the flow of investment that's needed into countries to make that shift.
Yeah. I would imagine that's relatively complex, but again, accessibility and yeah, like you said, the just transition is important on a global level, not just in certain areas. And do you have a question to follow up with?
I had a question from a while ago just about weather and location of where you install solar panels and wind turbines, but maybe it's more of a statement rather than a question, because as the weather is changing and as certain locations may be more favorable to wind versus solar or other things, the weather patterns are so dynamic that you can have high winds where you cannot run a wind turbine, right? It will burn out the engine to do that. Or you have hail that destroys solar panels. So, it's so random. It's very hard to predict how the maintenance and how the replacement and serviceability of these would come into play. So, it's difficult, I would say, as a statement, it's probably very difficult to factor that into the longevity and let's say the output of those types of energy systems.
That's very challenging. And what I would just comment on that statement, so I agree with that statement. It is challenging, and the reason for that is, of course, climate impacts, and that's the changing weather patterns. Exactly. And that's, we come back to kind of our original conversation around why we need to phase out fossil fuels, because these are the types of impacts that climate change is causing, and they will only get worse if we continue using fossil fuels. So
yeah, that's quite powerful. I mean, we've noticed
We've seen it all the time. I mean,
Yeah,
even in Zermatt, the rain
Yeah.
this past week has been devastating.
absolutely. And I think that's, I mean, we're feeling the impacts of climate change everywhere, and it's not just, like, oh, it's hot outside, it's the weather patterns, exactly as you say.
The extremity of it. It's not just a rainstorm. It's like a devastating, deluge of water coming down the mountain and taking trains out. It's really
the
bad.
floods, it's the wildfires. I mean, there's the droughts.
Yeah, the extremes.
The
I mean, the
extremes,
U.S. is going
exactly.
through a real situation of extremes right now, and we even notice it. And it's something that we really try to bring to the fore, is that when you're in the Alps, you really have to be aware now, because things can
It change on a dime, just really quick.
I mean, so it's really, So we're going to go to what we call our lightning round, where we just ask you a few questions and whatever comes to mind when we ask them. So we always ask this question. I always love hearing the responses. So do you believe that one person or one organization has the power to impart positive change?
That's a good question. So my instinct is to say yes, because we all have the power to impart positive change, but we have to work with each other and together with different stakeholders as well.
What do you wish you had more time for, Aniko?
This is a good one.
Yeah.
And if I'm being honest, spending more time with my husband.
Yeah.
Because as you know, and as I've been very lucky to be able to spend more time with my kids these past years, and now we're rebalancing to be able to spend more time with each other as well.
Yeah, that's super
Nice.
important. What book do you treasure the most?
Ooh, well, my favorite book is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Okay.
Because it introduced me to magical realism, which is a genre that I grew to love.
Mm.
And it also introduced me, it's how I started learning Spanish. So I started reading chapters of the book in Spanish, and yeah, I just really enjoyed it. So this is very personal.
Oh, that's so
Yeah.
beautiful.
Interesting.
Oh, maybe I could explore that genre in German because then
I
it
was
might
just gonna
help me.
say, yeah.
It might help me with my German acquisition.
The other one that I love is The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. That's
Mm,
also a really good one. And that's slightly shorter, maybe. That's
okay. Oh, cool. Okay. What do you think is most misunderstood or unknown about human rights in the environmental crisis we're currently in?
that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I think I'm optimistic that we're all trying to get to the same place. And maybe that's what's the most misunderstood, that everyone has good intentions. I'm a person who believes that everyone has the intention to get to somewhere where they are living in a planet where they want to be and where
Mhm.
they want their kids to live in the future. So it's just about how do we communicate among each other, and how do we share this kind of common goal and work our way towards it together without without alienating others in the process.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything you feel like we neglected to cover today or that you want to say before we end?
No, just thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here.
It's been really fun. It's been a really fun conversation. A lot of topics that I, usually discuss with a very technical audience. And
Okay.
this is no, it's fun to think about the bigger picture as well, because I usually just tend to zoom in on the very specific issues. So it's actually been very, very interesting, and I've learned a lot through this conversation as well from
Oh,
you.
that's
So thank you.
nice because we learned
Nice.
we learned a great deal. Yeah, and is there a resource or ways people can find more about you or the work you're
Mm.
doing or the work in this space?
That's a good question. I guess it depends on how technical you want to get. But
Mm.
I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn. So, me personally, the organizations that I work with, Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we could maybe put a link in the
Yeah,
show notes to some of
Absolutely.
the resources. For investors, there's the Principles for Responsible Investment that has a lot of resources available to them as well. And for kind of general public and parents, I love to use the EU has a few good resources
Mm.
for showing kids like fun board games for kids on sustainability and climate issues. And NASA has a few really
Oh,
fun
Okay.
resources as well. So we can put those in the show notes.
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, absolutely. That's so important. And I think it's so important, like you said, that we include children in these conversations. And it needs to be something that they're aware of, but they're engaged with, and that they feel like they have some agency
Yeah,
over. It's really
exactly.
important. And my final question as we close today is what impact do you hope to have on the world?
Mm. Um, I hope to leave the world a more inclusive and more kind of understanding place. I hope to be able to help other people express what they would like, as well. So to listen and kind of act as the voice for people who might not be able to reach certain audiences.
Yeah, it's so nice. I always get emotional when we have these. I'm like, it's so nice. Yes. Well, thank you for your time today, Aniko. We truly appreciate it.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Yeah.
Thank
very
you
much.
so much.
Yeah.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to be awesome and share this podcast with your friends. Click subscribe, rate, and review. Do you have a story to tell? An organization you'd like to tell the world about? We love to hear from you and our global community. So please get in touch with us at reVyven.com. That's REVYVEN.com. Or send us an email at reVyven.com@gmail.com.